Welcome to another episode of the Back to School Shootings podcast. My name is David Reedman. I'm the creator of the K-12 School Shooting Database. The episode today is being recorded about 9 days before Christmas. And it seems, really ominous to kind of connect Christmas and school shootings, but the really sad reality is that this exact same week last year, a father in Georgia was buying an AR-15 for his 14-year-old kid. And just a couple months later, he would take that Christmas gift into his high school in Appalachia, Georgia, and he would kill students and staff members there. And that's not a one-off. Just 2 years before that, on Black Friday, which Black Friday is the start of the Christmas holiday season, parents in Oxford, Michigan, bought their 15-year-old kid a pistol. And he took that pistol to school and committed a school shooting. So for parents to make a decision that they're going to buy a firearm for a teenage child shows that there's kind of a disconnect between what the purpose of that weapon is and why they're thinking it's an appropriate gift for their kid to have. And this falls into a topic that we had a podcast about a couple months ago. So today, for the second time, Dr. Tahir Rahman, the author of Extreme Overvalued Beliefs, is here to talk about this. Dr. Rahman, thank you so much for joining the show.
Thank you so much, David, for having me on again. And such an important and timely topic. And I'm glad that you found a way that we can talk a little bit about the paradox of American gun culture.
So before we get into American gun culture, we had a very lengthy discussion on a prior episode about extreme overvalued beliefs. That's the title of your book. It's also a phenomenon that is rooted in kind of an obsession or a fixation around a certain set of kind of irrational beliefs about someone's self. Since we talked about that for more than an hour, there's a link in the show notes. If you haven't listened to that episode yet, I would suggest you listen to that first before we get into the much more detailed discussion of how that dovetails into firearms today.
Yeah, that's a great suggestion. And just real briefly, an extreme overvalued belief it's a belief that's shared by others in a person's culture, religion, subculture, and it's relished, amplified, and defended by the possessor of the belief. And that's different from an obsession or delusion, because an obsession in psychiatry means that the person has a thought that's intrusive, unwanted, and usually ego dystonic, which means they want it to go away. That's an anxiety disorder. And most of those people don't do this mass shooting type stuff. And then a delusion is different because that's part of a psychotic illness, like schizophrenia or bipolar mania, where the person has a break in reality testing and actually believes, for example, that aliens from Mars are attacking the Earth, or something really bizarre like that, or microchip is planted in their body by the government, things like that. Those are delusions. But this shared ideology, we're all familiar with it because many acts of terrorism like 9/11 and the Oklahoma City bombing, the U.S. Capitol attack, there's plenty of examples of that. But I'm trying to draw attention to school shooters also having a school shooter culture or subculture that's relished, amplified, defended. The Columbine shooters are often quoted in manifestos by subsequent school shooters. And so this glorification of school shootings and even weaponry is something that's really important for us to talk about.
And then on weaponry, so you just published an article in Psychology Today. It's within the forensic psychology section, and it's called Shifting the American Relationship with Firearms. And in this article, you talk about firearms as being a symbol of power. And I think that there's a difference between somebody who owns a firearm for utility, somebody that wants it for hunting, wants it for personal defense or home defense, wants it for the camaraderie of target shooting or waterfowl shooting or something with their friends. And that's much different, having something for utility versus having something for the ideology that it represents. Can you kind of explain those differences?
Absolutely. So a weapon can almost become like an avatar or an emotional and ideological extension of the individual, in which case they're actually broadcasting their identity. And one of the important threat assessment tools we use is identifying as a warrior, identifying as a soldier for a cause. And you'll see some of the shooters um, pose with weapons or guns and put those photographs on social media or on websites. And so there's this extension of their ideology. In some cases, people have personalized their weapons with inscriptions, symbols, or modifying the gun in some way, but they're really amplifying and uh, putting forth this identification as a warrior. And I think that can be a red flag in terms of threat assessment that we should be paying attention to. And then sort of the cult of the gun experience, the cultural glorification, I think is important because as a parent, if we're teaching our children that these are some sort of defiance and um, a symbol of defying the government and defying society like a sovereign citizen might do, that gets into a real extremist viewpoint and can be dangerous for society in many ways. And just to give you an example, in 2021, there was a Wakefield standoff in Massachusetts, the rise of the Moors, where they identified as sovereign citizens and engaged in an armed standoff with the state police. And they were very heavily armed, and many of these followers of sovereign citizens believe that they can reject the government's authority, and even laws regulating firearms don't apply to them or anyone else. And so these extreme beliefs have led to violent confrontations. And so we have to be aware that this culture exists.
So then to frame what we're not talking about is the person who, buys a rifle and it's, in
Sure.
their case or their safe and they take it out, a couple times a year
I
to
took
go
hunter safety.
hunting.
I grew up in the 80s. We took hunter safety classes. I grew up in Kansas. So that was like an elective that everybody wanted to take was hunter safety. And you learned all about, treat every gun like a loaded gun, keep them locked, And so there were these rules that you learned and you memorized them and you had to recite them. And I think that that's an important thing that's missing. That's an element that's missing in our schools and our culture now is the difference between reverence for guns and worshiping them, making them into ideological artifacts versus this is a tool, practical tool used for hunting, self-defense, survival in some cases. That's an ideological shift in America over the last 20, 30 years. And as as an American citizen, I worry about that. What's going on with that, and we need to transform this relationship we have firearms back to the way it's been in our country's entire existence. Uh, so this is something new, and I think that I would love to see people have more of a conversation about collective safety, which ensures that the Second Amendment stays where it traditionally has been, with a commitment to life, security, and accountability, really. And that's very different than having this belief that in these ideological frameworks that can lead to terrorist attacks.
Yeah, so that's really the difference between, you're going to go waterfowl hunting. You need a bunch of different gear. You need your decoys. You need your camo. You need your heater. You're going with your friends. You're going to talk all day, and the gun is a tool that's part of that experience, but it's not something that's at the center of the experience. You
Yep.
don't sit around in the hunting lodge afterwards with everybody inscribing something on their weapon. But what you've talked about is that there's this transformation from a firearm just being this kind of foundational, constitutionally protected tool of American society into being a sacred object, being something that is a symbol of identity, power, and defiance. Kind of what's an example from a recent incident where somebody really represented that symbology of the weapon as being kind of central to their identity?
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And so there are attacks that have taken place, and on my Psychology Today blog, I talked about Peyton Gendron, the man who walked into the Tops grocery store in New York and opened fire on black people. And on there, he on his weapon, he actually wrote, "Here's your reparations," referring to slavery reparations. And um, so he actually identified with this great replacement theory, or a great replacement um, belief that black people are somehow taking over the country and are replacing white people. So that's called the great replacement theory. And he actually identified with being a warrior for this cause in his life. And that kind of extension is a great example of an avatar of a weapon becoming an emotional and ideological extension of the individual, where he's actually broadcasting his intent, his identity as a white supremacist neo-Nazi, basically.
And the same is true also, which you write about in your blog for the Nashville school shooting at the Covington School, or the Covenant School. And in that case, there were also inscriptions on the firearm, but they were more kind of cryptic in nature. So these can be both something that's really highly individual and personal, or something that's part of like a broader social group, right?
Right. And in that case, the media was really interested in the fact that Audrey Hale was transgender. And to me, that wasn't the important part of the story. What was important was sort of this gun cultural identification and putting markings on these weapons, and holding that out as what the person was identifying with, what Audrey Hale was identifying with.
And that history in school shootings to the weapons customization really started in Columbine. I mean, I've studied school shootings back to the 1960s. In most of those cases, somebody had a pretty standard weapon. Some cases, single shot rifles, revolvers, shotguns. Uh, they're relatively rare to have semi-auto rifles through the 70s, 80s, and 90s, because they were just such a niche weapon that really, you couldn't get unless you were a specialty collector. They're very hard to find. There was one shooting in 1989 at Stockton, California, that involved the semi-auto rifle. But what's different about Columbine is the weapons became kind of central to the plot in the way that they were customized and named and inscribed and so on. Could you talk more about that?
Yeah, I think some of the more recent shooters have had a cultural shift, and that cultural shift will have things like words imprinted or even imbued into the gun's frame or metal. And some of these symbols, inscriptions, um, are really fascinating to look at. And so there's almost like a symbolic elevation of firearms as becoming the badge for these individuals. And there's also a little bit of a defiance and contemptuous emotion with it, where they're holding themselves as being more important or superior to others. And I think that defining it that way is certainly in the realm of an extreme overvalued belief, um, because it's relished, amplified, it's defended. And the belief sometimes grows more dominant over time, more refined, more resistant to challenge. And where more do you see this refinement than in things like instruments of tools or of what weapons? And I think that symbolizes that refinement. And that's one of the things we look for in threat assessment is the person refining their beliefs and becoming more binary, simplistic, and absolute as they move uh, from it being a fixation to becoming this really embedded, extreme, overvalued belief. And then the other threat assessment tool we look at is pathway, which means planning, preparing, acquiring weapons, bombs, um, other tools which can be used in such destructive ways. So often it starts as a fantasy for many of these individuals. And I think you and I talked about that on a previous podcast, where the fantasy of being um, this all important figure that will be known forever in the school. Everybody's going to know who I am. Everyone's going to always remember my name because of what I did. That fame seeking. And I think that fantasy can sometimes involve these weapons as well. And they certainly start researching the weapons and copying some of the weaponry that were used by others. And the Columbine incident is one that is often quoted in many manifestos. Audrey Hill, the Nashville shooter, modeled themselves after the Columbine shooters as well. I was also going to mention Robert Crimo III. Remember that case? The Chicago Highland Park shooter, who also was provided weapons by family members. Do you remember that case?
Yes, that was the 4th of July parade shooting. Great. But I think an interesting phenomenon that has changed in the last couple of years is that it's not just individuals that are inscribing and making guns personal or making guns represent an image or an ideology or a symbol. This is something that's actually happened at the corporate level. Now, if you just put into Google Trump and gun into just Google and take a look at the image search, there are dozens of different manufacturers that make guns that have Trump's face, have Trump's signature, have likenesses of him. But there are also a number of major manufacturers that have guns that are biblical in their themes. There are AR-15 rifles that are inscribed with Bible verses across the rifle. And then really strangely, there's a company in South Carolina that made a gun specifically for the Bugaboo Boys, who are a domestic terrorist group that wears Hawaiian print clothing, is their signature. So this mainstream manufacturer, which actually the previous president visited their factory, they have a rifle that is in a Hawaiian shirt, floral pattern, and it's called the Big Igloo rifle. And Big Igloo is the code word for Bugaboo. So there's some very overt messages and symbols that are associated with cult-like personalities, with religion, with white nationalism, with Christian identity movements, and even with domestic terrorist groups that are actually mainstream productions of weapons.
Right. I worry that those then become megaphones for ideology because, you know, people really relish and worship and glorify in many different ways this weaponry. And instead of glorifying back to the original way that we used to think about guns in America, we're glorifying these other ideologies.
And that shows also, I mean, really the evidence of this is if a gun is simply a tool, which it is for most people, you would buy the best price tool that's available for the purposes that you want. if somebody is going to buy a pistol that's many times more expensive than a regular 45 caliber pistol because it's inscribed with Trump's face, or somebody's going to buy a rifle that's significantly more expensive than a regular AR-15 because it's the Bugaboo Boys edition rifle, that shows that they are making a purchase that's about the symbol, not the utility of the item they're buying.
I think that anytime somebody's relishing a weapon or ideology that signifies or references white nationalism or hateful slogans, hateful symbols like the swastika, you know, we get we can certainly make inferences from what their beliefs might be from that. And often my friends who are really opposed to guns and are afraid of guns and want to ban guns need to understand that the way you fix some of this cultural problem is by joining and doing it the responsible way, not simply saying, I don't like those and I don't want to have anything to do with them. Because if the part of America that wants to fix these things just stays silent and watches the extremists take over everything, then this will never correct itself. So those of us who are responsible gun owners need to step up to the plate, and people who are afraid of guns need to not be afraid of guns, and they don't that doesn't mean they need to run out and buy one, but they do need to try to embrace the idea that guns are part of a culture and they're part of our country's heritage and history, and instead go into the schools and reframe what these weapons are all about. And that actually demystifies it if you do that. So if you go into a school and train kids about hunting and train them about if they want to learn about self-defense, training them about that, and then gun safety. And if you do that, I think it takes away some of the coolness of owning one of these radicalized guns. So somebody who's around weapons a lot isn't going to be as enthralled at going after the cool, neo-Nazi gun. But if guns are seen as something to ban, then a person might be drawn more towards that ideology because they see it not only as uh, a weapon to own for self-defense, but also as a weapon that's symbolizing these other ideologies, which we're trying to stop.
And that is really a constitutionally valid way to look at this problem, because about half of the people in the country own a firearm. Most of them have that firearm for purely utility. The estimates are it's about 6% of gun owners that own more than 90% of the guns in this country. So there's a very small subset. If it's half of the country has guns, and then only 6% of that half, so about 3% of the people own almost all of the guns in the country. That's showing that there's a very strong and kind of mixed up mentality in that subgroup of gun owners. But I like your point here that rather than banning a weapon or talking about banning a weapon, what we need to talk about is banning weapons as a symbol of hate and violence, which hate speech is not protected by the First Amendment. We have wide First Amendment protections. Hate speech is not one of them. The Second Amendment protects gun ownership, but is there a way to say that gun ownership is different from having guns in a way that they represent hate and violence?
Yes, and I think the narrative that you reshape is going from glorification to responsibility, accountability, ethics, stewardship, not defiance and some sort of identity that is of hate. And
And
then,
those folks that are the small number of people who own, dozens or hundreds of weapons, that seems like it starts to border into like a clinical obsession where you're making decisions that are probably not the best for you, your family, your finances. It's not a rational thought making process to say, I'm going to spend tens of thousands of dollars on a weapon or on multiple weapons when there's no way that I could use all of them at the same time to defend my house. Like if you have, one AR-15 for your house and one for your car, do you need 25 more that are in your closet as well, and each one of them inscribed and decorated in a different way? That seems to move from ownership to clinical obsession.
Yeah, there's a lot of people that collect and own guns that are very safe and very diligent people, and many of them are ex-military, ex-police officers, law enforcement, and I think many of those individuals I feel very safe around because they've handled guns their whole life and they have a very they're very diligent about safety. And if you ever break one of their rules around them, you're going to get vented at for doing it the wrong way because you're putting everybody in harm's way that's around you. And if you ever watch people in the military or law enforcement fire weapons, it's done in an extremely safe, extremely regimented, with rules. And you learn all those rules, and you break those rules. There's consequences for breaking those rules, and that culture of safety is really important in law enforcement and in the military. Otherwise, we would have accidents happening every day, and it would be a horrible, horrible thing to watch. So, freedom can come from responsibility, and our liberty and our freedom in America must start with a collective safety commitment, not glorifying anything.
And I
And
think a good example of that is the first Trump assassination this summer in Butler, Pennsylvania. The adolescent shooter there. I mean, he's a young adult, but he was pretty much in your same age as school shooters and mass public shooters. Yes, he was wearing a T-shirt when he was killed that he wore to the rally, and as you know, there's a tremendous amount of thought that goes into every single thing that a person's going to wear. They're not just going to wear a random T-shirt when they commit a school shooting or a mass shooting or an assassination. And it was a shooting for a YouTube. It was a T-shirt for a YouTube channel that glorifies shooting at all kinds of different objects, especially objects that are going to explode and doing tricks with guns. And that is completely different from the way that a military or a law enforcement person would think about disciplined shooting, safe shooting, shooting for purpose. There's a lot of glorification of shooting for novelty, shooting for attention, and shooting in these ways where your gunshot blows up a train car. That's in this realm of fantasy.
right. And what's interesting in the Crooks story is that he tried to affiliate with his rifle team in high school. And because he was such a bad shot, they didn't take him, ironically. Um, so that you can imagine how he must have felt humiliated and what kind of grievance he must have had towards the school and towards society in general after being rejected like that for not making the rifle team. Um, and I think that you're absolutely right that there needs to be this balance between gun ownership in, in terms of uh, your right to own one and our collective safety in society. And parents, I think, are the main folks to help reshape this in America, and schools are too. And if we are afraid of guns and want to constantly talk about banning guns, this will never happen because that's a polarization in our society. And instead, if we can get schools to embrace gun safety in class, where students are taught these things openly, then we can fix that balance. and restore it. Because otherwise, you have this extreme polarization where one side is afraid to talk about it, doesn't want to normalize it in any way, and then the other side revering it and sticking people in the eye with the whole ideology of guns politically, and using that uh, as a as a political weapon as well as an actual weapon. So this, I think that the polarization is in part driven by social media too, because of the way our algorithms work, which is a whole different hour topic that we could have about how social media algorithms push people towards each corner further and further, because you have to, because it's binary choices. You either have to agree or disagree with the post. And in my latest Psychology Today blog, I talk about how using rating scales could help with internet polarization. So we don't have people picking thumbs up, thumbs down, I love this, I hate this, and then having a toxic uh, discussion, which is what all of these discussions end up being, toxic. And the the binary thinking on social media leads to a toxic relationship. But if you actually have these discussions with people in person, they're like the one you and I are having now. People actually do want safety, and gun responsible gun owners don't like the fact that there's some individuals within gun ownership circles that are doing this, that are making this ideology part of owning a weapon. And um, I'm going one step further and saying that some of that can be dangerous to our schools and to our children, because relishing, amplifying, and defending white nationalist ideology and prior school shooters is the fantasy of the school shooter. And um, we have to have a different narrative. And people who don't like guns can take a leadership and role in this. And so if you're a person who thinks that, all AR-15s should be banned and that there's too many guns and the Second Amendment should be repealed, if you're a person who thinks those things, I would urge you to learn about guns and become more safety oriented to ensure everybody's success.
So, in that
You
kind
can
of
read.
normalizing the way that we talk about guns, normalizing the way that we talk about gun ownership, and creating a broader status quo around what's acceptable, that your gun is a constitutionally protected item that you have, it's intended for utility. If that can be where the majority of people sit and agree on, then you're outliers. Then those 3% of people who own dozens or hundreds of guns, then those people, is there, there are hundreds of plain wood and black guns sold for every one that has Trump's picture or has a Bible verse or has the Bugaboo Boys print on it.
Right,
If there's more norm building around regular ownership,
right.
then those other people stand out more at the edges.
That's right. So, we can take alcohol, drug use, other things as models to try to learn from also. Um, other behaviors that people have, or driving a car, wearing a seatbelt. There are ways, I mean, young people don't think it's cool to get in a car and not wear a seatbelt. You don't see that. Young people know that wearing a seatbelt could save their life. And uh, young people have adopted that. I can remember I'm showing my age now, but I can remember, people not wanting to wear seatbelts when they first came out because they saw that as their right to refuse to wear a seatbelt, and um, cars then were designed to have better safety features. And so, as time has gone on, we've shifted over to cars that have much better safety features than older ones did. And part of that safety involves education too, because you have to learn about what the car can and can't do to help protect you and keep you safe, and what habits you need to learn as a driver to keep you safe. And we all get behind that. And it's something that could easily be adapted over to gun safety and um, gun responsible gun ownership. And I think that we should, as a society, relook at the way our culture views weapons and guns, and moves more towards education. Education of anything is always the right answer if it's done properly and under good supervision. And parents obviously are having trouble with some of this, but otherwise we wouldn't be seeing this. People are giving Christmas presents to a kid who's fantasizing about shooting up a school. That's not good. And I think in a twisted way, some of these parents might think, well, if I buy him the gun, that'll make him more safe somehow. And I think that there's a misguided approach out there with some of these
Well,
things.
in some cases, like looking at the Oxford parents who are both in prison now for buying the gun that was used in the school shooting, they seem to, the parents, not just the child, seem to be somebody that sits in that gun, the camp of the gun being something that's a symbol. I think it's really evident from the social media posts that the mother made when the gun was first purchased, where she wrote, look at this beautiful beauty, taking this beauty out to the firing range for the first time, using language that you would normally describe a child or a new dog or a painting with, and applying that to a weapon shows that somebody's thinking about it in a non-utilitarian way. They're thinking about it in the way that it represents something. And I think that is a common ground that we could reach in gun advertising as well, because if you look at gun advertisements, not from your major brands that sell hunting weapons, but from your niche manufacturers that are selling these highly customizable military weapons, the advertising is all about the symbol. It's about, this gun is getting your man card back. This sniper rifle, which shows a guy on the rooftop in a downtown urban area, the message under that is, be heard from the rooftops. So the way that the niche combat gun industry is advertising is not about utility, it's about symbology. And it seems like that would be something that is not protected by either the First or Second Amendment, and is a clear sign of something that's being sold with the intent of violence.
Or at least with the intent of making a lot of profits from it. I mean, I think that that's probably the main motive for a lot of those is gun sales. I'm sure that's a very profitable business to be in. And yet, those companies can also take a role in doing exactly what I'm talking about, providing safety and maybe providing images of other more neutral uh, gun customizations. You know, there doesn't have to be white nationalist symbols on guns. You can put other symbols on guns, right? Um, so, it, and there are people that do that make uh, customized guns with very neutral and very personalized identification without some of these hateful slogans and symbols that we know are associated as extensions of ideology. And so I think that there could be some corporate responsibility in that way to make it more balanced.
Well, you point to profits, and a big piece that's different from the gun industry as opposed to alcohol or tobacco or just about anything else is the blanket legal protection that these companies don't have any sort of financial risk if they're guns are used. I think your point is really interesting about the really careful decorations and so on. If you look at old hunting rifles or old shotguns, there's a lot of metal work. There's very nice wood grain handles. There was expert craftsmanship that went into building guns that would last for generations. But in the 2000s, after the expiration of the federal assault weapons ban, this has been widely reported, but there were some meetings within the gun industry and within corporate advertising. They said, what's our next evolution of weapons? And the AR-15 was created as a profit center. It's very cheap compared to a wood grain rifle that has all this ornate metal work on it. An AR-15 rifle is dirt cheap. It's metal, it's plastic, and the reports are it's about 5 times the profit of selling one of those old hunting rifles. Plus, it opens up all of these opportunities for customization and personalization of that weapon. So we have across, U.S. history, whether it was aviation or cars or the pharmaceutical industry or the tobacco industry, when a corporation has been endangering the public for their own profits, we've eventually had pretty strict backlash. And it seems like that is an opportunity in this area to look at companies that are perpetuating symbology, especially symbols of hatred, and to address those problems, head on.
Yeah, I think the narrative in America is, are you for gun rights or are you for gun control? So you have to kind of like pick this binary choice. And that can easily be shifted to shared values of safety, responsibility, and preventing violence. And that's something uh, both political parties and all political parties can get behind. Every human being in America can get behind shared values of safety, gun responsibility, violence prevention, regardless of where you are on this debate. And we should be focusing on empowering the people who already are responsible gun owners and reducing, misuse and really even misinformation about gun owners. And so, um, I work in a hospital setting around a lot of great people, and people don't really discuss gun education in universities and schools and workplace. In fact, those things would probably get you into trouble if you talked about things like that. So I know one of my kids once brought up something about guns in high school and was frowned at by his teacher, like, you don't talk about guns in school, that's like a taboo subject.
Which is a good point in the threat assessment process, that there has been a negative impact on many more students than students who have been identified as possible perpetrators of violence, because any kid who says something about a gun, sends a meme of a gun, draws a picture of a gun, is overheard mentioning gun, even pointing a finger gun in Florida will get a kid arrested, even a kindergartner arrested. That what might be a much more useful way to think about threat assessment is looking for the extreme overvalued beliefs that somebody is exhibiting, rather than any mention or reference to a firearm being your criteria for the threat assessment and for your formal juvenile justice involvement.
Right. So, like, utterance is different than having it framed by an entire ideology. And somebody who meticulously researches prior mass shooters or school shooters is much more concerning than somebody who has an utterance because they're upset that day. Doesn't
Or
mean
not even upset. In many cases, these are clearly jokes. I think about how disastrous the post-Parkland law in Florida has been, which requires a mandatory arrest for any student who's perceived as making a threat. And in one of those cases recently, it was an elementary school kid sent a meme to his classmates. And because that meme had a gun in it, he was arrested and perp walked in Florida. And that's, if we have two different problems that are there. We're casting a wide net, which when you cast a wide net, you catch a lot of the things you didn't intend to catch. And if we're casting it in the wrong direction, because a meme of a gun is completely different from somebody who maybe never mentions a gun, but has these deep, extreme, overvalued beliefs about hateful ideologies. I think that we need to completely reshape the way that we're thinking about a lot of this assessment process.
That's exactly right. I think that there's a lot to learn here, for people who do threat assessment to understand that these symbols may have more than just a, a cool meaning. It may actually have an ideological meaning. And that requires some further digging. If we see symbols, we need to determine whether the symbol represents an ideology or not, and whether it's framed by an ideology. And then move on into the realms of fantasy and in threat assessment pathway, grievances, uh, personal grievance, moral outrage. These are important things to look for in threat assessment. So, um, simply just owning a weapon like this is not a red flag, and or I shouldn't say is not a red flag, is not a solitary by itself, doesn't mean as much as it would if it's with these other uh, warning signs, warning behaviors, which I talk about in my book. There's a chapter called Red Flags where we talk about things like identifying as a warrior for a cause, uh, extreme overvalued beliefs, which we covered earlier, pathway, grievance, last resort. These are all really important aspects of threat assessment that threat assessment professionals really dig deep into when they're doing assessments.
I like your point about consensus building. And unfortunately, to build consensus, a lot of times we do need a binary because somebody needs to pick one side or the other. Once you have too many different choices, it becomes really difficult to have any sort of consensus because there are half of the country owns guns. Most of them are good people. Lots of kids are in a household that has guns. Most of them are good people. I wonder if, from hearing to you, there's a new consensus that we could build that's actually much larger than the pro-gun, anti-gun, groups. And that's, are you somebody who supports the Constitution, safety, and firearms as a utility? And it seems like that's about 97% of the country. And then are you somebody who supports hate, obsession, destruction, and mass murder of innocent people? And that's the 3% of the country that are seeing the weapon as a symbol of power that is rooted in all of these different hateful, violent warrior rhetorics, neo-Nazi, white nationalist rhetorics.
Right. So because politically people are forced to choose, that becomes an option or choice that they don't see anymore. It becomes washed away. The the binary thinking washes away the safety talk because the shortcut that we learn in our brain when we bring up the word gun is either I'm for Second Amendment or I'm for gun control. It's not anything else. And so there is a third answer here. The third answer is let's embrace gun safety and gun education, hunting education. Um, all those things can be a part of a curriculum. Um, a curriculum of safety, a curriculum of responsibility, a curriculum of heritage. The Remington rifle, the Colt 45. There are parts of guns that are really ingrained in American heritage and culture. And I don't think there's anything wrong with learning about that. People should learn about the Rough Riders and Teddy Roosevelt, and they should learn about um, Patton and his ivory pistol. There's some cool aspects of American history with guns that can be tied into some of this, and there's no reason to fear that. Um, and I think getting back to that, I think that was the case in the United States for a number of decades, and as we've become more polarized over this issue, this gun safety part has sort of just sunk away. And
Well,
now
the
we
market has changed considerably. I mean, we really need to pay attention to that because
That's right.
anybody who's not familiar with the gun industry, which I think a lot of the people that listen to this podcast and a lot of school officials and parents probably aren't, is the form of guns, the way that they're sold, the availability of purchasing them, and how cheap they have gotten is way different than it was in the 70s or 80s or 90s. Right now, I can go down the street to a gun store, and for $200, I can buy a pistol that's almost all plastic. It's available in Barbie pink or camouflage or whatever patterns or designs or colors. It looks like a child's toy. It's dirt cheap. You can buy, an AR-15 rifle for like $400 at some places. Like these are not significant investments. Where in the 1980s, if you were buying a really nice over under waterfowl hunting Remington rifle, that might be $1,000 back then. And with inflation, you're now looking at something that you bought for a lifetime and for a specific purpose and for a specific hobby. An item now costs a fraction as much and has the power to kill or injure quite a few people, because an AR-15 or a semi-auto handgun is designed to be a weapon that harms people, not animals. And those guns are cheaper than they've ever been, and they're more easily accessible than they've ever been. And that's an enormous cultural difference from the previous 300 years of our nation's history.
very, very important what you just said. I'm glad that you pointed out. So there's shifts in culture that uh, the history and manufacturing and uh, the ideology behind some of uh, the way guns are owned and bought and sold in America has also dramatically shifted, as you state so well.
So going into the holiday season, we're about 9 days from Christmas. Some people listen to this before, some after, some maybe before next Christmas. Lots of families that have different views are going to be coming together. Lots of people are going to be exchanging gifts. Within that, almost all of it is goodwilled. But my two questions for you before we wrap this up are: first, what would you tell other family members around the table to start building consensus around this? And second, what are some signs to watch out for to show that somebody's moved toward those extreme overvalued beliefs rather than just, acts of gift giving?
I think that a gun is a tool of survival, if you really think about it in a primitive historical way. And when a tool of survival is transformed into a symbol of identity, power, then society has to reckon with the dangers of that fusion of radical ideology, hatred ideology, and the violence that can come from that ideology. So their guns are no longer just weapons in America. They are mirrors of a fractured culture we live in. They reflect our deepest fears, grievances, divisions, and that is where we are in 2024 and now 2025 coming around the corner, and we can change that. I think Jeff Cooper, the Art of the Rifle guy, a well-known gun advocate, said that the rifle has no moral stature since it has no will of its own, and it's the evil men using it for evil purposes. But he also said that there were more good men than evil, and you mentioned that in your you mentioned that earlier in the podcast. And so the good can correct the bad, and that is what has to happen with the culture in America surrounding weapons and guns, not only from the people who own them and cherish the Second Amendment, but also from people who are concerned about gun violence and maybe avoid being a part of the gun club or gun culture. That both sides should embrace and collaborate with law enforcement, educators, policymakers to design better interventions that um, can surround safety. And I think that can be done.
Well, Dr. Tahir Rahman, thank you so much for joining the show today. There are links in the show notes. Dr. Rahman is the author of Extreme Overvalued Beliefs. We recorded a previous episode about it. It's also, a book that's really worth reading. There's also a link to his latest article in Psychology Today. And unfortunately, this probably won't be the last time that we talked. But thank you for your time last time and this time. And I hope you have a happy holidays.
Thank you so much, David, for having me, and happy holidays to everyone out there.